And do you think we've not developed it enough? Is that a failing of modern Western spirituality or religion?
I think we feel that to be respectable we've got to talk a certain way. By the way, this sort of thing I find, I've explored this in a number of sciences, like my own science of archaeology, where there's a preconceptual stage of our thinking, which most archaeologists wouldn't own up to, because it's not very respectable. It's not a thing you put into a scientific report. But I know when I've approached a site or an artefact, and I've got the feel of it, you know, you really got to feel an artefact. Or when you're digging a trench, you've got the side of the trench there, and you start reading the sections, and it's, in a way, you're sort of entering into the life of that. In your own mind, you can see in the sections of the trench, you see levels of life at their various ages. Well, then you start to write it up, and you've got to put it into scientific language. You've got to number it, and you have statistics, and so on. And then it becomes a respectable piece of work. But you mustn't deny the fact that your original approach to this whole thing was highly unscientific.
Yeah, intuitive.
Yeah. And this is why, you know, Albert Einstein, there's our famous story how he came on this idea of relativity in a moment, then spent the rest of his life trying to prove it. Yeah. Or people who, I mean, the story is often told about people who have a sudden intuition. But the trouble is, intuitions are not very, I mean, Albert Einstein probably wouldn't be able to write a very good scientific account of his intuition.
Yeah.
Because it's not the respectable language we use.
The great religions of the world have tended to be fighting one another, trying to prove that my God's bigger than your God. Do you sense some great change going on in the world that's drawing in religions closer together, that we as humankind are searching for a theology that embraces or is embraced by all people?
Yeah. My own personal experience is with the interfaith group on the Blue Mountains, and I find a great affinity between us. It's not simply coming together in a polite, courteous way and sort of having nice cups of tea with each other, but there's actually an exploring of each one's attitudes, an interest in one another. And John Darcy May, a theologian who's been based in Dublin for a long time, he's an expert on Christian Buddhist dialogue, and he seized upon this as a way of an approach between Christianity and Buddhism. So it's not only my own personal experience, but also that of an expert.
Is it something that you see is only happening in the last 50 or 20 years, or is this something that you've seen right through your lifetime?
Well, I've seen it in my own lifetime because of my own experience of religion. I would have had exactly what you describe as a tribal approach. I remember very well when I was a child, but Catholicity was a very tribal, very triumphalist thing, and saw itself as differentiated from the others. I remember even as school kids we used to get up in gangs, and the Protos and the Catholics were opposed to one another, and we used to fight in the streets. That, and then there's, I remember shortly after ordination, sectarianism was very strong in Australia. But then again, I was very sectarian. I was all part of this culture. So I've seen a change in myself, as well as seeing a change in society. That there's more accommodation and more interest taken in one another. And it's not so simply tolerance. I find the word tolerant is rather condescending.
Yeah.
That's more than that condescending tolerance. It's a sort of feeling that we can learn from one another. So, for example, I can learn about meditation from Buddhists. I can learn about mindfulness and compassion. Or from Muslims, I can learn about, they've got this terrific idea of faith. Islam, in fact, means that the surrender of faith. And even though some of the extremes of Islam, we see in terrorism, we have to realise that a strong motivation behind mainstream Muslims is this great sense of surrender to God, Islam, its faith. And each of these religions has something really very positive. I can learn something about my faith from a Muslim. I can learn about my prayer from a Buddhist, and so on. I go through each of these religions.
Yeah.
So there's a respect for those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not only respect, but really an interest.
Yeah.
I want to find out more, that type of thing.
Did you see this book you've published as something new? You've spoken to me about getting a group of theologians together to discuss this, and that suggests to me that it's something new.
No, it's really... if you read the Bible, you find that the language of the Bible is in what I would call archetypal forms. You read the fathers of the church, and again, their language is part of this. And this was the general way of doing theology in the early years of the church. They describe it as monastic or mystical theology, which only came to an end really around about the 12th century with the onslaught of scholastic philosophy, which was more rational, Aristotelian. But I find it's coming back. People like Merton, for example, has a great appeal to people because this is his way of thinking. And I notice that he draws very heavily on Russian theologians, again with this kind of mystical thinking. But what I'd like to do is to explore this deeper level of thinking more closely, see how it works, see what its rules are and its procedures, and see how we can make use of it in our religious expression. So I feel it's a very fertile field for theologians to get together and explore further. I feel I might have made a beginning, but it's only a beginning. I feel there's a whole lot more.
What are the obstacles in Australia to that happening?
It's very hard to get theologians together. But this is actually happening in all academic fields. Our professional theologians, like professionals in other fields, they're employed at universities, they've got an overload of students, an overload of assignments, tutorials, and they all say, I don't have time to do research anymore. So that is the state of in Australia at the moment, that it's very hard to get people who are able to sit down and start researching and discussing and taking it deeply.
Do you also see this being a reluctance to speak publicly outside the official dogma? And is this perhaps opening up under Pope Francis? It's going to get a lot easier for me.
I don't think it has anything to do with a dogma or doctrine, particularly as our sources of revelation are all expressed in this way. But the reluctance I would see is it's difficult even for an academic to move into a new field. It's outside of a comfort zone, if you like.
Yeah.
And I find there are theologians that say, yes, all very interesting, but that sort of feeling that they're not accustomed to this way of thinking. And I would dearly love to see the situation where a number of us could start exploring further and further. I can only go so far on my own, as I've only made a beginning.
Yeah.
The deep within is only a beginning of this sort of thing. But I think it'd be very fruitful. And I say particularly in this area in Australia, where we have still got to come to terms with Aboriginal spirituality. I wrote a book on this called The Aboriginal Gift, and it also was only a beginning. But I think to really understand Aboriginal thinking and let their thinking have a real influence on us, we have to go to a deeper level of thinking and engage them at a level in which they are accustomed to thinking. Because I think that, particularly in their traditional life, that they are living in this sort of mythical world, if you like, or archetypal world all the time. But if we came to grips with that, I think we would find that there's a real dialogue here. Peter Newell wrote about the Christianity in Ireland, how it started by monks arriving in Ireland and having dialogue with the Druids, who were mystics in an animistic sense, and they realised that they had a lot in common, and that gave rise then to the peculiar thing that we call Celtic spirituality. That was a very fruitful interaction between Christians and non-Christians. I would love to see the same kind of interaction happening in Australia.
And at the level of popular culture in Australia today, with all our emphasis on materialism and the profit motive and getting ahead in life, is there an interest here in wider society in exploring things at this deeper level?
I think we've found that despite our being caught up in this very material, capitalistic kind of world, economy, I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction that it's empty, it's got nothing else. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is a thirst for this sort of thing. And this shows up in people who go off onto New Age religions, or people who go off into some fundamentalist forms of Christianity. But I think in all of them we see the thirst for something deeper, something to fill that gap in our lives.
So what can we do as Christians or Catholics to encourage that search for an archetypal theology?
I've just been reading the Pope Francis's exhortation, what is it called? Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. And it's the most extraordinary beginning, where he says, that we're filled with joy, the gospel fills us with joy when we come into encounter with Jesus Christ. And the whole thing is, I've got about 80 pages of it, but it's overflowing with this joyfulness of taking out into the world something we want to share. But right, the first sentence, he says it comes from the encounter with Jesus, which means we have to meet with Jesus, and that meeting with Jesus is what we mean by prayer. It's at that level in which we experience then the joy of knowing that for all our faults and our failings and so on, there's a merciful God, a God who wants to shed his love on us. And Pope Francis, in many of his statements and in many of his actions, is portraying this joyfulness that comes from realising that this God is merciful. This God wants to overlook all the odd things we've done, and just to pour out his love on us, and through Jesus.